Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and in the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of nature, in the spirit of Gaia, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. I've just returned from a week in Amsterdam. I'm now back in California. It was a very interesting journey. It was the first time that I've been to Europe in my lifetime, where there's been the shadow of war in the European region. And it cast a pall on everything that we were doing. And, you know, it's one thing to be watching the invasion of Ukraine on television, on CNN from a very long way away. It's a completely different matter to be there knowing that the front line is just, a few hundred miles away. Europe is really a very small place, and the distance between countries is very narrow. It's one unified region. I'm now back in California, and we want to turn our attention today to something that I'm very, very excited about, because it's going to be conducted with one of my oldest and dearest friends. We're going to begin today a series on the great court cases, great investigations that have pitted freedom against tyranny, human rights against authoritarianism, and give testament to what Thomas Jefferson said at the founding of the United States, that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And whether it's in the Ukraine or any one of our countries, all of us who believe in human decency and the right of every human being to exercise democratic voting, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to express our views in an open, transparent, egalitarian way. We need to always bear in mind that these freedoms are under threat. And therefore, we want to celebrate a man, Daniel Sheehan, who's been one of the foremost constitutional litigators in the United States for the past 50 years. He and I met at Harvard, actually, in 1973. We were both studying at the Harvard Divinity School. He had gone to Harvard College, where he excelled, one of the co-founders of the Harvard Law Civil Rights Review, 1968, and has gone on till the present day to be at the forefront of constitutional litigation in the great struggle to establish democracy as a permanent fixture in human affairs. So we'll be hearing just in a moment from Danny, and we've just picked one of the great cases. He's been involved with Wounded Knee, with Karen Silkwood, with 3 Mile Island, with the Pentagon Papers, so Standing Rock. So over the next months, we're going to have storytelling of these great cases from Danny. But before we do that, let us pause, as we always do, to just take a moment and close your eyes and attune yourself with your heart. And as you listen to your heartbeat, just for a minute, feel the solidarity with people who are fighting for democracy. all around the world. Thank you, everyone. Now I'd like to introduce you to Danny, and he'll just lay out the story of the Iran-Contra case. He may want to indicate some other aspects of his biography that we should take note of. And then he's just going to tell the story. And then when he finishes the story, I'll circle back. I'll be monitoring the comments and questions in the chat. Then we'll have a dialogue for the balance of our time together. But Danny, welcome to this series on great constitutional cases. And I turn the program over to you.
Terrific.
Good to see you.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here. Let me do this, this situation that we're in right now, as Jim has introduced it, we're at this peculiar time where we're just facing this bizarre event of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia that is going on right now. And we are, in our country, being exposed to daily details of the war. CNN, MSNBC, ABC, all of them are filled with visions of buildings being blown up and people evacuating and tanks rolling through the countryside and down the streets and people fighting in the streets against the tanks, and in Russia, the people are all being shown only one television station where it's talking about the heroic efforts of their troops to go in to protect the people of the Ukraine against what they keep asserting to be a fascist government that's in power there, and that they need to go and save the people from there. So both sides of this dialectic are being just inundated with information that is flowing to each side, insisting that their side is the champions of freedom, and yet they're at war with each other. And so that what we want to do is, in this particular unique period of time in our history, we want to go back and take a look at our country and the struggle that we're engaged in here all the time for the last 240 years, to try to bring to full fruition the concepts of democracy and individual liberties. This is an extraordinarily important experiment that is going on in the human family right now. And sometimes we're doing very well at it. Other times it's in recession. What I want to do is I want to take you back to 1980. This is now what, 42 years ago. This is the time when Ronald Reagan was elected president. George H.W. Bush was elected to be the vice president. George H.W. Bush had previously been the director of the United States Central Intelligence Agency. Ronald Reagan had been one of the major proponents back in Hollywood, back in the 1950s, of the anti-socialist fervor that seized the country with Joseph McCarthy, and they started banning people, the famous Hollywood 10 and others who were too far to the left in the progressive agenda, started throwing them out of Hollywood and banning them from being in motion pictures, et cetera. So the history of Ronald Reagan and both George Bush was decidedly on the side of authoritarianism, the lack of tolerance of other people's points of view, et cetera. They came to office in 1980. And what we have been able to establish at this point, which is setting a context for this, is that in the election of Ronald Reagan versus Jimmy Carter in that 1980 election, the United States Central Intelligence Agency's director of covert operations worldwide under George Bush, when he was the director of the CIA, a man by the name of Theodore G. Shackley, actually operated behind the scenes to draw money in from the Nicaraguan Bank in Australia through two banks in South Africa, millions of dollars he brought secretly into the United States and funded a major campaign, not only against the presidential candidate, in that case, Jimmy Carter, but also against 4 of the major United States senators who had opposed the criminal covert operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. This was Frank Church from Idaho, the other United States senator from Iowa, a United States senator from Indiana, a United States senator from South Dakota, and a United States senator from California, all of whom had opposed illegal covert operations on the part of the Central Intelligence Agency going around the world, suppressing democracy and facilitating the installment into power of extreme right-wing authoritarian governments, directly contrary to the entire advertised position of the United States government. And so with the coming to power in 1980 through this mechanism of not only secretly funding the unseating of opponents of the Central Intelligence Agency, but indeed, remarkably enough, carrying out secret negotiations with Iran to keep in custody 52 American hostages that had been taken into custody by the Khomeini government in Iran, and holding them, getting an agreement to hold them until after the election, so that the Reagan-Bush campaign could criticize Jimmy Carter for being ineffectual in being unable to get back our hostages that have been taken, American hostages. So this is the setting in 1980 of the coming to power of an extremely conservative administration with Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush as president and vice president. So that this is the setting that we're looking at here to try to get people who either were not alive back in 1980 or who it was so long ago, now 42 years ago that people can't quite remember it. But this is the setting. And when Ronald Reagan and George Bush came to power in 1980, they began to undertake steps not dissimilar to what Donald Trump had done when he came to power here in 2016. He began to roll back through the exercise of executive authority, environmental protection rules, any kind of rules that restricted corporate power, suppressing speech, having an extremely reactionary Justice Department that was cramping back on civil rights. Both of these things happened under both Ronald Reagan and George Bush in their administration in 1980, similar to what happened with Donald Trump in 2016. On the other side of the ledger is the Democratic Party, which has a more liberal history. They are promulgating individual liberties, a much more pluralistic type of society, limiting the kind of power and authority of corporations, placing more emphasis on individual liberties than on the power of government to suppress speech or restrict individual human rights. This was the context in which we found ourselves with the election in 1980 of Ronald Reagan and George Bush. 4 years into their term, they had accomplished a good deal of this rollback. And one of these things was one of the favorite topics of the right-wing elements in the Republican Party is the suppression of refugees being allowed to come into the country. They did not want non-white refugees coming into the country. And so that they in fact started a program down on the Mexican border, the very famous border that Donald Trump kept talking about all the time, trying to effectively seal our border against all of these extremely un-American, Latin American people coming into our country illegally. There was a program that had been set up by the Carter administration, the Refugee Act of 1980, that came in just before Reagan and Bush were elected. And that it was a program in the United States whereby if a person from any country in the world found themselves being repressed and their civil rights violated and their life and liberty was threatened because of their political beliefs or their religious beliefs, that if they found themselves in the United States, they had a right to apply for political asylum. This was the Refugee Act of 1980. And the Reagan-Bush administration had secretly issued orders, executive orders to the Immigration and Naturalization Service down along the Mexican border to, instead of granting refugee status to people who came in and applied for it and putting them through the legally required processes of evaluating their claim, that they had a legitimate fear of death or imprisonment because of their political beliefs or their religious beliefs, that rather than give them the hearing that was required by law, what the Reagan and Bush administration were doing was ordering those people to be taken into custody and immediately returned to the country of their origin. And they were notifying the government authorities of the bus or flight on which these people were going to be being returned to that country. And they were systematically disappearing. They were being seized and taken into custody as soon as they were deported back to their country of origin, and they were disappearing, being imprisoned or tortured and killed. And this was the situation that obtained in the spring, just here in April, again, 38 years ago, into their administration in 1984. Ironically, the year that George Orwell was talking about in his famous book, 1984, that there would be a repression of individual liberty, and Big Brother would be attempting to assert authoritarian domination over the population. I was on the early April, I think it was around April 4th or so of 1986. I am at our house in Washington, D.C. I was legal counsel for the United States Jesuit Order in their National Social Ministry Office. This was the Jesuit Order, which is the largest single order of the Roman Catholic Church, and are noted for being quite progressive now in their present incarnation. And I was contacted by Father Phil Wheaton. He was an Episcopal priest. He was on the board of directors of the American Sanctuary Movement. This was a movement primarily of ministers and priests and rabbis to try to assist the refugees that were being systematically tortured and disappeared in various Central American countries, specifically in this case, El Salvador and Guatemala. And what happened is that there were two political refugees, a woman by the name of Maria and a young man by the name of Mauricio, who had escaped from El Salvador and had come up through Mexico and crossed the Rio Grande River and had come to the sanctuary that was set up in Brownsville, Texas, on the Mexican border by Bishop John Fitzpatrick, the Catholic Archbishop of Southern Texas. He had set up a sanctuary for these political refugees to come to, and then he would take them through the legal process of qualifying or not, or qualifying to be a political refugee, to be able to stay here in the United States until it was safe for them to return. Well, I was at my office out at the Franciscan Monastery in Washington, D.C. This is where Dr. Jim Garrison and I both lived, where it was on the grounds of the Franciscan Monastery in Washington, D.C. Our whole staff lived there of an organization called the Christic Institute. This was a public justice office that we had set up out of the National Jesuit headquarters, and we set it up to help people all across the world when they were confronted by threats to their civil liberties and human rights. And so I was contacted that morning, I think of April 4th of 1984, by Father Phil Wheaton, and he said that he had been contacted by Catholic Bishop John Fitzpatrick that night before, and had asked to have us from the Christic Institute come down to Brownsville, Texas, because one of his Catholic nuns, Sister Diane Mellencamp, and one of their Catholic social workers, Stacy Lynn Merck, and a Dallas Times Herald newspaper reporter by the name of Jack Fisher had all been arrested the night before. And they've been taken into custody by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS police, the migration police, they call them the Migra, had arrested them while they were trying to transport Maria and Mauricio, two recent refugees who had come across the Rio Grande River and had come to Bishop Fitzpatrick's refugee center, the Romero Center, they called it. They realized, Bishop Fitzpatrick realized that this illegal order was in place by the Reagan-Bush administration, refusing to abide by the law, refusing to abide by the Refugee Act of 1980. And instead of bringing the people in and putting them through the legal process to determine whether they were legitimate political refugees, they were arresting people and deporting them, as I told you earlier. And so Bishop John Fitzpatrick had allowed Sister Diane Mellencamp, the Catholic nun, and Stacy Lynn Merck to transport these two political refugees from Brownsville, Texas, northward up to San Antonio, where they were going to be allowed to go through the legal process of political refugees, because the order had been given by the Reagan-Bush administration only to the immigration offices right on the border. And so if they could get up to San Antonio, they could be given a fair hearing. During that trip up during the night to San Antonio, they were pulled over by the Immigration and Naturalization Service police, and they were all arrested. And they were going to be prosecuted criminally in the federal court by the federal prosecutor, the United States Attorney down in Brownsville, Texas, and Sister Diane Mellencamp and Stacy Lynn Merck and Jack Fisher were going to be prosecuted criminally for providing illegal assistance to undocumented Central American aliens. It was a federal statute that prohibits aiding and abetting an illegal alien coming into the United States. So we got that call. We flew down to Brownsville, Texas, myself and Father Wally Kazabowski. Father Wally Kazabowski was a Franciscan Capuchin priest. I was a candidate for the Jesuit order at the Jesuit headquarters. We flew down into Brownsville, Texas, and were picked up by the Archbishop and the Vicar General, brought to the home of the Vicar General there right in Brownsville, and we began to provide the defense, the criminal defense for these two refugees. It's too long a story to go into much detail about what they had confronted, what had confronted each of them down in El Salvador that caused them to flee. But suffice it to say, for purposes of this account, that they were both totally legitimate political refugees who had been threatened by the right-wing death squads in El Salvador that were being operated by Roberto Dubuisson, the man who was responsible for assassinating Archbishop Oscar Romero down there, and for imprisoning and torturing and killing tens of thousands of people. And while I was there at the trial defending these people, Bishop Fitzpatrick was approached by the bishop of the Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church in Brownsville, and this bishop told Bishop Fitzpatrick, the Catholic bishop, that he had been warned by one of his congregants, the people in his congregation had come forward and said that this Methodist bishop should have nothing to do with the American Sanctuary Movement or a Roman Catholic bishop, John Fitzpatrick, in the American Sanctuary Movement, because the American Sanctuary Movement was smuggling known communist terrorists into the United States under the guise of being legitimate political refugees, and that these Central American aliens, in the event that President Reagan and Vice President Bush found it necessary to send the United States Army into El Salvador to prop up the Salvadorian authoritarian government, or found it necessary to send US military troops into Nicaragua to try to overthrow the Sandinista government, which was a socialist government that had risen to power after ousting the longtime right-wing fascist dictator Anastasio Samosa, who had been in power. His grandfather had been put into power back in 1903 by a United States Foreign Expeditionary Force that went in and overthrew the democratic government in 1903 and installed the original Anastasio Samosa as an authoritarian dictator there in Nicaragua, all on behalf of the United Fruit Corporation, as it turns out. But the bottom line is that I was contacted by Bishop Fitzpatrick. He said, look, this Methodist bishop has come to me and said, look, he can't have anything to do with the American Sanctuary Movement because Archbishop Fitzpatrick had been trying to talk the Methodist bishop into opening up his church as well for political refugees. And so Bishop Fitzpatrick said, the Methodist bishop has said to me, look, you can't have anything to do with the American Sanctuary Movement because they're smuggling known communist terrorists into the United States. And in the event that the President Reagan and Vice President Bush decide that they're going to send US military forces into Central America to either overthrow the Sandinista government or to prop up the extreme right-wing authoritarian government in El Salvador, all of these political refugees that are here in the United States, these illegal Central American aliens who are coming in under the aegis of the American Sanctuary Movement, these known communist terrorists could organize themselves into military cadres and attack our military bases and attack our police stations and blow up our electric transformers or poison our reservoirs. And he went on and on about all of these horrendous things that these illegal Central American aliens might do. And so that Bishop Fitzpatrick was stunned at this representation that had been presented to the Methodist bishop. And Bishop Fitzpatrick said to the Methodist bishop, he said, well, as it turns out, the general counsel for the United States Jesuit Order in their social ministry office is here, right here in Brownsville. He's the lawyer that's defending the Catholic sister here, Diane Mellencamp and Stacy Lynn Merck and Jack Fisher, against these criminal charges. And so the legal counsel for the Jesuits is here. And if anything like that were going on, if there were really people being smuggled into the United States who were known communist terrorists, that at least the Jesuits would know about that. Because the Jesuits, after all, are not only the largest denomination in the largest order in the Catholic Church, they are the intelligence corps for the Catholic Church and for the Vatican, and they're the diplomats, the intellectual leaders of the educational facilities, and they are the most sophisticated and well-educated and most knowledgeable element in the whole Catholic Church. And so at least the Jesuits would know if this were true. So he agreed to introduce me to this Methodist bishop. And so I met with the Methodist bishop, Wally Kozlowski and I, and Bishop John Fitzpatrick all met with the Methodist bishop. He laid out this story to me. And it turns out that the person who was in his congregation, who had come and said that to him, was the director of the FBI in Brownsville, Texas. He happened to be a member of the United Methodist Church and went to the church of the Methodist bishop. And so that he approached the Methodist bishop and presented this thesis to the Methodist bishop. So I told the Methodist bishop that I was sure that wasn't true, because in fact, if it had been true, I, as the legal counsel for the Jesuit order in the United States, and the head of their National Social Ministry Office with Father Davis, would know that. And it's not true. But I promised him that I would look into it and try to figure out where this ugly rumor had originated. So I went back to the trial and we went through the whole process. We got all the charges dismissed against the Catholic nun. We got the charges all dismissed against the newspaper reporter from the Dallas Times Herald, and we got all the charges dismissed against Stacy Lynn Merck, the Catholic social worker. But in the process, what I did is I reached out to people that I knew that could help do the investigation. I reached out to Father William J. Davis, who was the director of the Social Ministry Office in Washington, to have him touch base with the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Jesuit priests and nuns that he knew, to find out if there was any truth to this and where a rumor like that might have started. I contacted William Johnstone Taylor, who was my chief investigator when I was at the office of F. Lee Bailey, the major criminal investigator, most famous one in the country. I contacted Howard Rosenberg, who was the chief researcher for Dan Rather at CBS. I contacted Howard Cohn, who was the Washington bureau chief for Rolling Stone magazine. And I contacted Bob Fink, who was the investigator for Congresswoman Bella Abzug, who was the chairperson of the Human Rights Division of the House of Representatives House Judiciary Committee. So I got a hold of all of these people to have them start doing an investigation to find out where this rumor had come from. And we get finished with the trial down in Brownsville, and I get contacted by William Johnstone Taylor, my chief private investigator. He was a 3-tour Vietnam Marine Corps veteran, a criminal investigating division of the United States Marine Corps, and one of the major investigators for F. Lee Bailey. And so he called me and said, "Look, I've found out the answer to your question, but I can't talk about it on the phone. You got to fly down here to Florida to meet with me." So I flew down there. He was the president of the Florida Association of Professional Private Investigators, and the #1 leading criminal investigator in Florida. So I went down and met with him face to face, and he said, "Look, I put out the information that I was trying to find out where this rumor had come from, this false rumor that the American Sanctuary Movement was smuggling known communist terrorists into the United States who were going to be attacking our military bases in police stations and stuff if President Reagan and George H.W. Bush found it necessary to invade one of the Central American countries. And he said, I got a call from an old friend of mine, he said, who was in the Marine Corps with me in South Vietnam. He said that his friend was the director of the National Guard. He was the commander of the National Guard in Louisiana. And I flew down to talk with him. And this man told me that the source of this rumor had come from a readiness exercise, a military readiness exercise that the Reagan-Bush administration was engaging in, a top secret military readiness exercise here in 1984, and it was called Rex 84. That's Readiness Exercise 1984, Rex 84. And this was a secret military plan they had that they were rehearsing, airlifting the 82nd Airborne of the United States Army out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, under the cover of night, and flying them down into Nicaragua or El Salvador, where they would invade and establish martial law, and either prop up the extreme right-wing government of El Salvador or try to overthrow the more left-wing government of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And that operation was codenamed Operation Night Train, by airlifting the 82nd Airborne out of North Carolina and flying them under the cover of night into Central America. It was Operation Night Train. And what had happened is that a man by the name of Louis Giuffreda, who was the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency under Ronald Reagan and George Bush, had heard about this, found out about this, and said, wait a second, if you launch this invasion into Central America, whether it's into El Salvador or Nicaragua, what about all of these undocumented Central American aliens here in the United States? Oh, they're probably going to be organizing themselves into military cadres and attacking our military bases, our police stations, and blowing up our electric transformers and poisoning our reservoirs. So we had found out where this rumor had come from. But the commander of the Louisiana State National Guard, when he had Bill Taylor there with him, said, look, there's something else, Bill, I need to tell you about. This kind of bizarre. This readiness exercise that the Reagan-Bush administration is undertaking right now, of not only airlifting the 82nd Airborne down into Central America, but this thing with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, this man, Louis Giuffreda, has persuaded Ed Meese, who's the chief of staff for Ronald Reagan and George Bush, has persuaded him to have an additional part of the readiness exercise, have the Federal Emergency Management Agency practice rounding up these 150,000 undocumented Central American aliens pursuant to this readiness exercise. They're not going to do it, but they're going to rehearse how they would go about doing it, just like the Army is rehearsing how they might go about airlifting the 82nd Airborne out of North Carolina into Central America. The rehearsal is going to be having the Federal Emergency Management Agency figure out how they can round up these 150,000 undocumented Central American aliens and imprison them in these stockades that they're building on 10 different military bases around the United States. And Louis Giuffreda was in charge of that. But he had a problem that there's a federal law called the Posse Comitatus Act. Federal law prohibits civilian law enforcement or the military from deploying any United States military forces inside the United States to attempt to enforce laws. They're not allowed to do that. And so what they were doing is they were going to go to the National Guard and have the National Guard work with a group of private citizens private citizens that were going to be organized into these things called the State Defense Forces. And it was going to be like a civilian civil defense group that were going to be created by statute in certain states. In several southern states specifically passed statutes in their legislature creating these state defense forces. And they recruited them by getting recruits who were reading things like Soldier of Fortune magazine, Robert K. Brown's kind of infamous monthly magazine for all these guys that are running around in the woods with paintball guns and shooting each other and playing war games, these wannabe military people. And they were recruiting these private citizens into these state defense forces. And this had happened in Louisiana. And Louisiana had this group of state defense forces. And this commander of the National Guard in Louisiana told Bill Taylor that, look, this peculiar thing happened, that in our participation in this Rex 84 military readiness exercise, we were instructed that we were going to be provided a whole cache of weapons, shoulder-fired weapons, M16s, pistols, bazookas, all kinds of military equipment. And we were, the National Guard in Louisiana, supposed to provide this to these private state defense forces people, these right-wing kind of loonies that were going to be participating in rehearsing how to round up these undocumented Central American aliens, because they were not part of the military. And therefore, it would not violate the Posse Comitatus Act. So these private citizens were going to be deputized, in effect, to practice rounding up these undocumented Central American aliens. And what had happened is Louis Giuffrida, the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency under Reagan and Bush, had said, look, he went to Ed Meese, the chief of staff for Reagan and Bush, and he said, look, as long as we're going to be rounding up these undocumented Central Americans, why don't we round up the Americans, the American citizens who might not be trustworthy, in case Ronald Reagan and George Bush, when they launched this military invasion into Central America, would declare a state of national emergency. And if they declared a state of national emergency, what about these American citizens that might be unpatriotic or disloyal to the government? Shouldn't I round those people up too? And it turns out there's a list. There's a list they call the ADEX, is the administrative index. It's a list of over 4,400 people who have been designated by the Attorney General's Office of the United States Executive Branch. 4,400 American citizens have been listed as being potential threats to the national security of the United States in the event that a president finds it necessary to declare a state of national emergency. Now, the peculiar aspect of this whole thing, of many, is that there is no such authorization for the president of the United States to simply declare a state of national emergency and suspend the Constitution and allow the arrest of some 4,400 American citizens simply because somebody had figured out that they may not be adequately loyal. And so Louis Giuffrida had demanded that he be given this list. And William French Smith was the Attorney General at that time in the first term of Ronald Reagan. And so Louis Giuffrida went to William French Smith and demanded a copy of the ADEX list, this administrative index list of 4,400 American citizens who had to be rounded up, he thought. Is a practice, rounding these people up. And William French Smith refused to do it, refused to give it to him. So, Louis Giuffrida went to Ed Meese, the chief of staff, and had Ed Meese order the Attorney General to give the list to Louis Giuffrida. William French Smith still refused. And so Ed Meese went to President Reagan and demanded that President Reagan demand this list from William French Smith. William French Smith refused to give it to him, saying this is completely contrary to the Constitution, and this is totally illegal, and I will not do it. And if you fire me for refusing to do this, I'll tell everybody. I'll tell everybody about this list, and I'll tell them why you fired me. And so he backed them off. Okay, and so I end up finding out that Bill Taylor continues talking to the head of the National Guard, and the National Guard guy says, "Look, there's this peculiar element to this. We were being instructed to receive all of these weapons from the United States Pentagon and to distribute them to these right-wing Zanos that are in this the State Defense Force, Louisiana State Defense Forces, and we were ordered that after we had distributed these weapons to them, we were supposed to revalue the value, the monetary value of each of these weapons, and increase the value of each of these weapons from its original distributed value to its higher replacement value." And so in effect, if we distributed out $1 million worth of military equipment to these people, we were supposed to increase the value of that to $2 million, which is this much higher replacement value. But we were ordered to collect only the same dollar amount of weapons that we distributed. So in other words, we get $1 million of military equipment from the United States Pentagon. We distribute it out to these right-wing, wannabe soldiers of fortune, and then we collect back up only half of the weapons, the same dollar value of $1 million at the higher replacement value. So Bill Taylor said to him, "Holy mackerel," he says, "what the hell is this? Is this some kind of 7 Days in May scenario?" Which is an old movie, which you all should see. It's called 7 Days in May. John Frankenheimer produced this movie at the direct request of President John F. Kennedy, actually. It's this right-wing effort to overthrow the American government by extreme right-wing elements. And so Bill Taylor said, "What the hell is this? Some kind of 7 Days in May scenario?" And the commander of the National Guard in Louisiana said, "Oh, no. They're going to be smuggling all of these weapons to the Contras down in Central America." The Contras were the extreme right-wing National Guard forces under the dictator Anastasio Samosa in Nicaragua, who, when he had been ousted from power by an uprising of the people, they had fled the country. His National Guard leaders had fled the country with Anastasio Samosa and were hanging out over in Uruguay. And they were organizing a military force to try to overthrow the new Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And so they'd been caught mining the harbors, the international harbors of Nicaragua, which is in complete violation of international law. It's a violation of the laws of war. You can't mine international harbors because it stops all of the commerce of the world. And it's a danger to the shipping. And so the International Court of Justice had found the Contra forces of Anastasio Samosa, who were in exile trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, to have been an international criminal organization. And because of that, everybody was refusing to give them any support. In fact, the United States Congress had passed a specific resolution, a law passed by the Congress of the United States prohibiting the Reagan-Bush administration and their executive branch from providing any assistance of any kind to the Contras, either direct or indirect. So what had happened here during the course of the American Sanctuary Movement trial down in Texas, we had stumbled across the illegal mechanism by means of which the Reagan-Bush administration was attempting to violate the Boland Amendment, which was the statute that had been passed by Congress, prohibiting them from giving any aid, direct or indirect, to the Contra forces. So we had walked right on top of this violation, which in fact would have supported the impeachment of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, as it turns out, CIA Director Bill Casey, Secretary of State Caspar Weinberger, the Attorney General, the Chief of Staff at that point, who was Ed Meese. You know, there would have been 24 men actually that would have been impeached for their involvement in this type of a criminal violation of a direct law passed by Congress. And so we at that point began a major investigation of that criminal operation, the so-called off-the-shelf enterprise, and that we found out all about this. And in the time that I have remaining here, the last 10 minutes or so of this talk, I want to tell you what it is that we discovered, which is an absolute total threat to the entire set of democratic institutions of our country that was mounted by the right-wing elements inside the Reagan-Bush administration. This is that our Constitution of the United States invests the exclusive power in Congress to make a decision as to whether or not our United States government will go to war against anyone, all right, or any other country. And the executive branch is completely forbidden for mounting a military war against any other nation without an express authorization from Congress. That Congress, the branch of government under the most direct control of the democratic people of our country, is vested with the exclusive authority to declare war. And the executive branch is prohibited from doing that. This is the separation of powers, a constitutional principle in a democracy, because historically, the danger that exists in all governments is to allow the executive branch, that is the king, the president, the military people, to allow them to make the decision to engage in war, because that's what they're always into. That's what they're trained to do, and that's what they're disposed to do. And so that the constitutional founders of our country back in 1789, the founders of our Constitution explicitly put into the Constitution this prohibition against the executive branch engaging in these types of military activities. And this is especially true if the Congress of the United States, as they had in this case, had passed a specific law prohibiting them explicitly from engaging in any kind of military operations in support of the Contras. So what we had done is we had discovered an absolutely impeachable offense that was engaged in. And so we brought this action to the judicial branch of our government. We put together a federal criminal racketeering act, civil prosecution of the members of this enterprise. And we notified the Congress, we notified the newspapers, we notified the media. It resulted in the appointment of a special prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh, who undertook this major investigation and concluded that what we were saying was true. This was an absolutely unconstitutional, illegal undertaking on the part of the highest levels of the Reagan-Bush administration. And he believed that they should be impeached. And he was progressing to do this, and he indicted the first 6 of these people, including Secretary of State Caspar Weinberger, the CIA director in the Central America. He indicted 6 of these people and began to criminally prosecute them. What happened is that George H.W. Bush, in the meantime, ascended to the presidency in the United States, and he pardoned all of them because the fact is George H.W. Bush and his national security advisor, Donald P. Gregg, were coordinating this criminal operation and were engaged in this massive criminal, unconstitutional, anti-constitutional criminal conspiracy to support this ardent right-wing fascist organization down in Central America, attempting to overthrow a government, another government with whom we were at peace. So they were mounting their own war against these people. The United States Congress investigated it, finally, but all of this was driven by the fact that we had discovered this operation. And it was being concealed. And the right-wing elements in the Congress didn't want to do anything about it. The Justice Department, of course, it was under the control of the Reagan-Bush administration, wouldn't do anything about it because William French Smith had left and Ed Meese had been made the Attorney General of the United States to be in charge of the Justice Department. And so they wouldn't do anything about it. And so what we discovered is that there is a constant element that you have to be concerned about in any democracy. The hardcore right-wing authoritarian would-be dictators are always present, and they're always trying to get the upper hand. And so we as the citizens have to be eternally vigilant. As Dr. Garrison has said, we have to be eternally vigilant, and we have to be constantly on guard, watching out for them attempting to usurp this kind of power. And this Iran-Contra case, I recommend that all of you find out everything you can about the Iran-Contra scandal. Those of you who don't remember it and don't know about it, because it represents a constant underlying threat to democracy that we always have to be on guard about. And that is why Dr. Garrison has asked me to tell you about this historical event that took place, how we ended up having to find out about it, private citizens, and the steps that we were able to take to publicly expose this and shut down that operation. But it hasn't prohibited it from rising again. And it's important that you keep that in mind. And I'm very thankful to Jim Garrison and to the People Rising show to give me a chance to tell you all about that. It's important for us to keep this in mind at this moment when we see another authoritarian government, foisting its power onto another nation state like the Ukraine in violation of international law. We have to seek refuge in the laws of our country, the international laws of our planet, to protect fundamental liberties. And that's why I've come to you today to ask for you to pay attention to this, to protect our rights and our liberties when they're under threat, not only from a foreign power such as Russia in this case, but from elements even inside our own government and inside our own country. Thank you very much.
Wow, Danny, thank you. We have a few minutes left, about 20 minutes, and I'd love to have you tell more detail on what you also discovered around weapons being sent down to Costa Rica, to the ranch of John Hall, and then drugs being brought back in. Right. I think that's a very important aspect that people need to know about. And then also, just as much for entertainment as anything else, tell the story of Ross Perot and how you went to him and how that pathway led to some very interesting machinations at high places.
All right. Yeah. Well, let me take a moment. It turns out that the mechanism that the Reagan-Bush administration's people, specifically Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was a member of the National Security Council, which is this group that meets at the White House, that's made up of the head of the military Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Justice Department, the Vice President, and others, that they had designed a mechanism for secretly smuggling all these weapons down to the Contras, these forces of the National Guard that were in exile to try to overthrow the government. They had chosen to use drug smugglers to figure out how to smuggle these weapons to go to the Contras. And at first, when we found out this, we said, wait a second, this is extraordinary, because we're discovering that these same flights where they're flying the weapons down, they're landing in Costa Rica at this ranch. An American expatriate by the name of John Hall has this great big series of ranches down in Costa Rica. They're flying these weapons down and landing on the ranch and distributing the weapons out to the Contras and loading the planes up with cocaine and flying back into the United States and distributing the cocaine in the United States and using a portion of the funds generated by the sale of cocaine to purchase more weapons and then to bring more weapons down. And at first we said, oh, this must be some renegade element that's doing this. But it turns out that's a policy of the American Central Intelligence Agency. The American Central Intelligence Agency has been smuggling narcotics around the world for the last 50 years. and using income from the heroin and cocaine to secretly purchase weapons, to distribute to hardcore right-wing elements all around the world, to mount military operations against democratic governments, because the democratic governments are in those countries are always threatening to utilize their own natural resources. And it turns out that the Central Intelligence Agency is an operation primarily to protect the interests of the United States corporations, to be able to gain privileged access to the strategic raw materials around the world that these major corporations need to have access to generate profits. This is an important thing to understand. So that's and what happened is that when Ross Perot was this ardent American patriot, a sort of what they call maverick multi-billionaire from Texas, a major tech wizard, and runs his major businesses. He had gotten terribly upset because he learned that during the Vietnam War, at the end of the Vietnam War, the United States had left behind as prisoners of war American POWs that you hear all about all the time. That there were 100 of these people or more had been left in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam who had been taken captive during the course of the Vietnam War, and that the United States government had not, in fact, retrieved these people. And so Ross Perot approached Ronald Reagan. As he said to me, that when you're a billionaire, they'll always take your call. He said, so he had contacted President Reagan and said, look, Ross Perot wants to undertake an investigation to find out whether we've got American POWs left in Southeast Asia and get them home. And it turns out that Ronald Reagan said, okay, I'll put you on my Presidential National Security Advisory Committee and give you the authority to investigate this. And so Ross Perot began that investigation, and he began to realize that most of the people that have been, or at least a lot of the people who have been left behind when the United States evacuated from South Vietnam, holding on to the bottom of helicopters and being airlifted off the roof of the embassy. There was this huge rush, not unlike Afghanistan, to get everybody out of Afghanistan. They did the same thing in Vietnam when they invaded there, and they were dragging these people out of there, and they left behind all these people, many of whom had been directly involved in protecting the opium trafficking that was going on. Because it turns out that the head of the station chief for the Central Intelligence Agency in Saigon had struck a deal with a major opium warlord there, Vang Pao, to help not only protect his opium trafficking, but to help him transport it, to fly it out with Air America. American Central Intelligence Agency aircraft were flying the opium out of there and were getting a share of the profits. And they were using that share of the profits of the heroin smuggling out of Southeast Asia to actually fund the creation of a thing called the Phoenix Program, which was a political assassination program that assassinated over 20,000 complete civilians that were not involved in any kind of military activities at all, but they were viewed as being unsympathetically patriotic to the right-wing fascist South Vietnamese government that had been installed by the United States. And so Ross Perot was stunned when he realized that a whole bunch of these people that were POWs may have been involved in being under orders from the CIA and the American military to facilitate the transport of opium and heroin. And so he ended up calling me, because he was told by actually David Taylor, the 20-year senior executive producer of the BBC in Washington, D.C., that Ross, you ought to contact Danny Sheehan over at the Jesuit headquarters. He's been investigating these same people because they're doing the same thing down in South America, in Central America. And they're the same exact people that were smuggling the opium and stuff out of Southeast Asia. So Ross Perot called me. He called me on the phone and he says, hello, Dan. Ross Perot here. He says, I've been on the President's National Security Advisory Committee to investigate all these people that are leaving the POWs back in Vietnam. He said, and I've been told by a lot of people that you know a lot about these folks, and I've determined that as long as these men are in operation, no man can call himself president. He says, so I'm coming flying into Washington, D.C., and I want to pick you up. I want you to come with me down to Texas. And I want you to lay out a wire diagram of who all these people are, write me a memo on this, and then I'll take it to the right people. And I said, well, who are you going to take it to? He said, how about George Bush? He said, I know George. He's from Texas. That he's sort of like a Boy Scout in this whole thing. I said, well, Ross, actually, if you want to take it to somebody who doesn't already know about it and who isn't actually involved in it, you ought to go to Bill Webster, who's head of the FBI, and he said, okay, he says, you write out the wire diagram and this memo, and I'll take it to Bill Webster. Dan, he says, it's one of the advantages of being a billionaire. They'll always take your call. That's what he said. So he did. I drafted it up for him. Ross Perot brought it directly to Bill Webster, the head of the FBI. That's how the Iran-Contra investigation got officially started. Even though we had been conducting for 9 months, we've been waging this war against these people in the court, trying to get discovery and putting evidence in against them. And the federal judge down in Miami had sealed our complaint and actually had told me that if I breathed a word of this, the mere existence of our complaint against these people, he would put me in federal prison for 6 months for criminal contempt of court. So I came back to Washington, D.C. and immediately went over and met with Tip O'Neill, who was the majority leader in the House of Representatives, and gave him a copy of it. And then went and met with Claiborne Pell, who was the ranking Democrat in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and gave him a copy of it too. That's how we were working with citizens inside the country, trying to use the legal procedures to bring these people to justice, to stop them from doing this. And it turns out that the federal judge down in Miami, James Lawrence King, had been appointed by Richard Nixon at the recommendation of B.B. Rebozo, a major member of organized crime. And it turns out that judge, James Lawrence King, had been on the National Board of Directors of the Miami National Bank of Meyer Lansky, which is the major mafia bank in the country, and were the ones responsible for laundering the money from the drug trafficking, and were in fact in charge of it. So what I'm trying to tell you is that you need to be a lot more on guard than you are right now about this element inside our country that is all over the place. These hardcore right-wing authoritarians who work with the mafia, they work with organized crime, they're smuggling drugs around the world, they're providing illegal arms and explosives to these right-wing terrorists all around the world. This is a lot more serious problem than you think it is. But I want you to know that there is an opportunity still in our country to utilize the legal procedures, which include mobilizing our people, educating our people, raising the consciousness of our people about problems like this, and utilizing all of the legal mechanisms, which include programs like this. But we're still allowed to do this here in our country, okay? We can talk to each other like this. We can communicate. I can tell you things like this without having someone break down my door and drag me out of here and put me in shackles for telling you this. This is extraordinarily important. And that it's not as though we're some wild-eyed bomb throwers. I spent my time, going to Harvard College. I studied foreign policy under Henry Kissinger. I went to Harvard Law School and studied under, Lawrence Tribe. I went to the #1 corporate law firm in the world, Cahill Gordon, and represented the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case. I was in F. Lee Bailey's office. We helped our client blew the whistle on Richard Nixon and got him removed from office. That I am a person who has spent 50 years working in this area, and I'm telling you what the truth of the matter is, and you should listen to me. And Dr. Garrison worked with me back before he was a doctor, back when he was actually in the midst of doing his PhD studies over at Cambridge under J.T. Robinson. He took a leave of absence and worked with me in the Jesuit National Headquarters to try to bring this information out. In the Jesuit order, now it was under Pedro Arrupe, the Superior General, and now under Pope Francis, are all working very, very hard to expose this element, not only here in the United States, but around the world, to try to overcome their constant effort to generate authoritarian governments around the world, almost always on behalf of the interests of major corporations. That's what fascism is. It is putting the instrumentalities of government at the disposal of the interests of major private corporations. That's exactly what Benito Mussolini, the head of the fascist party in Italy, wrote all about. That is what fascism really is. It isn't just simple authoritarianism. It's more dangerous than that. It's not just a bunch of individuals who want to be in charge because of their egos. This is a major systemic problem. That this is the rise to power of corporations who have no conscience at all. The creation of this instrument, this new financial instrument of a corporation, only came about in 1872, and it set up a private business vehicle by means of which the people who own all the resources and have access to all the profits of the company, the stockholders, are completely immunized against any personal liability. And so therefore, they have no conscience. And the corporation and their management are completely immunized. Their board of directors are completely privately immunized. It's just the finances of the one corporation that are all at jeopardy for any criminal activity or completely illegal activity they undertake to poison people, put out products that are dangerous, and they're immunizing themselves, so that this is a major structural problem that we referred to, Jim Garrison and I in the Jesuit order referred to as structural sin. These are sinful structures that are actually embedded in the country, that are not part of our Constitution, are not an intrinsic part of our democracy at all. They're incrustations that have been put onto our government and our society by private business interests. And we've got to be careful. We've got to undo these sinful structures. That is what we're dedicated to. Dr. Garrison and I and our other people that we work with and the citizens are dedicated to deconstructing the structural sources of injustice, not only here in Western civilization, but as we can see today in the headlines, also the structures in Eastern civilization. That there are sinful structures there as well. Okay, and so we have this obligation to do this. We owe it to our country. We owe it to our grandchildren. We owe it to the human family. That's why Jim has given me an opportunity to talk with you this morning about this. So I want you to be alert. I want you to be ever vigilant, because the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Oh boy, Danny. Thank you. Thank you for the encyclopedic memory that you have about our history. And thank you for your courage in moving right into the heart of darkness and the darkness of structural sin, and carrying really a torch that brought a great cancer to public attention in a way that enabled people of goodwill, like a Ross Perot, to do something that was necessary at that time to expose a great iniquity against the human spirit.
And it is important for people to remember, Ross Perot ran against George H.W. Bush for the presidency in 1992 and ousted him from power. Because Bill Clinton, who ran in that race, Bill Clinton won the presidency in 1992 with only 43% of the popular vote. And Ross Perot got 19% of the popular vote, taking it away from George Bush, who lost the election with only 38% of the popular vote. That's how Bill Clinton got elected president, and that's how Ross Perot played this role in ousting George H.W. Bush from power, in stopping that operation. And people need to know that. Amazing.
I'd forgotten that little detail.
Yeah, that little detail. Yeah. And that's why George Bush yanked our 501c3 our 501c3 tax exemption for the Christic Institute because he said
I remember, yes.
we'd been engaged in political activity because George H.W. Bush, suspected that we're the ones that talked Ross Perot into running against him. I'm not confessing that. I'm not confessing that on the air, but I guess I can tell you they're all dead now. And so, in fact, that's true.
Danny, I love you, brother. You are a great spirit, and I deeply respect everything that you've done and who you are in the world. And as we contemplate the complexities in our world, everyone, and the crises that we face, it's people like Danny that show us in an embodied way what an individual can do to make a difference in an area in which they have passion. So Danny, thank you so much. And we'll bring this program now to a close, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow here on Humanity Rising. But Danny's going to be back in a few weeks' time for another chapter of another case like Iran-Contra, where he stood tall and firm for the light of democracy. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
It's a real privilege. Thank you.
Bye for now. Bye-bye.